Chapter 15 is focusing on reform in the United States from 1790 to 1860. At this time, many people felt that there was a need for society to change, and so reform movements became very prevalent during this period of time to change society for the better. Now, before we can talk about these reform movements, it's important to look at the role religion played in these reform movements. At the heart of these reform movements is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, just like we saw with the first one, starting in the early 1800s onward, is a revival of spiritualism, is a revival of church membership, especially through the use of tent revivals, particularly Methodists and Baptists traveling across the country, bringing their religion to new people, saving people in these open-air tent revivals. Now, beyond just the Second Great Awakening, we also see an increase in religion, in part from that Enlightenment, that idea of rationalization. Two new denominations founded prior to this were Deism and Unitarianism. Deism was very popular among the Founding Fathers, was focusing on the well-being of mankind. Same with Unitarianism. They rejected Jesus as a divine entity and focused more on bringing about goodness for mankind. This is going to be at the heart of that Second Great Awakening reform movements, bringing about a good society for the American people. Peter Cartwright was one of these revivalists. He was a Methodist revivalist during the Second Great Awakening, focusing on bringing his religion to the masses, to the lower classes. Charles Grandison Finney was another one of these revivalists during the Second Great Awakening who focused on creating a perfect Christian kingdom here on earth. Why should we wait till we go to heaven, he said, when we can have this perfect Christian kingdom here on earth? That idea is going to jumpstart the reform movements. Let's change society for the better to make it more Christian-like, to make it more moral, so that we don't have to wait for heaven to have a perfect kingdom. Now, at the heart of the Second Great Awakening and at the heart of the reform movements are middle-class women. Now remember, women particularly have been given this role of being the heart of the family. We've talked about this with Republican motherhood, to train new Republicans. We've talked about this with the cult of domesticity, that women should be put on a pedestal that stay at home with their children and raise a good family. So it only makes sense from a middle-class woman's perspective. If she is the religious heart of the family, why should she not also be the religious heart of American society? And so to bring about this perfect Christian kingdom here on earth, middle-class women particularly are going to engage in these reform movements to change society for the better. Now, a couple of new denominations formed during the Second Great Awakening, particularly in the Burned Over District, as it was called, in western New York. The Adventists, this is a new group founded by William Miller in the 1830s. He reinterpreted the Bible, and his followers were known as the Adventists, coming out during the Second Great Awakening. More than that, though, we have to take a look at the differences between class and religion, or regions, I should say. Particularly certain denominations such as Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Congregationalists tended to be among the wealthier, more educated classes in American society. Whereas the Methodists and the Baptists, the center of this Second Great Awakening, tended to be in the South and the West, the rural areas, the less educated, poorer classes, because they are bringing religion to the masses. Another denomination formed during the Second Great Awakening were the Mormons, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, created by Joseph Smith. He was a Christian from that burned-over district, and in 1830 said he had received a prophecy from God, that he'd received golden plates with a new message from God on it from an angel. He translated those plates to create a new book of the New Testament, the Book of Mormon. This Church of Latter-day Saints, as they were called. So he's almost the new Moses. Leads his followers, the Mormons, during this period of time. However, as you can guess, they had a lot of persecution against them, particularly because of their belief in polygamy, that one man should be able to marry as many women as he wanted. So they faced a lot of persecution from their neighbors. They were fearful of them, much like we've seen with other religious groups at this time. So in 1844, Joseph Smith was murdered, and the church leadership was taken up by a new leader, Brigham Young, who led the Mormons out to Utah where they could escape this persecution between 1846 and 1847. Out in Utah, I should say, this is a desert, this is a wasteland, but the Mormons really made Utah into something special by creating a massive irrigation system so that they could grow crops out in Utah. And as the era of immigration continued, more and more people began moving out west and joining them out in Utah. So immigration actually increased their settlement out in Utah. However, the U.S. Army was very reluctant or very reticent against the Mormons out in Utah because they are controlling this entire region. The U.S. Army has no control over this territory. Also add to that the Mormons had their own militia, and we see some controversy or some conflicts, I should say, between the American government and the Mormons. All of this was laid to rest in 1896 when Utah was granted its statehood, which is also coincidentally when the Mormons got rid of polygamy as an official part of their religion. It is now banned in the Mormon religion. Now, in order to look at the reform movements, remember, the Second Great Awakening, from the Second Great Awakening, this refocus on religion and making society a perfect Christian kingdom once again, all of these reform movements stem. So if we want to make a good society, why not start by increasing education for the American people? Now, for a very long time, and we've already talked about this, the upper class people had been against free education. They didn't really want to pay for education for the poor. But as that era of Jacksonian democracy filtered in, and more people were given the right to vote, that universal manhood suffrage is leading for more of these poor people to start demanding education for their children. They want them to have more than they had. Also add to that the Industrial Revolution. Now, remember, people are going to work in these factories. People are given the right to vote. Doesn't it make sense then to have a literate population that not only can make decisions about how to vote properly because they have some sort of education, but also it makes the dissemination of information much easier in a factory system where you have thousands of workers possibly working for you. So we don't want an ignorant population voting. We don't want an ignorant population working in the factories. So we do start to see the growth of some education in America. But this education was very problematic, namely those little red schoolhouses where you have one school teacher teaching all of the children, all of their subjects, focusing on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Not a very extensive education. So Horace Mann, who was one of the main reformers when it came to education, he was secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. He called for educational reform within the state of Massachusetts. Specifically having better schools, a longer school year for the kids, better pay for the teachers so that you could attract professional teachers, and a more focus on curriculum to truly improve education. His reforms in Massachusetts actually did spread across the United States and is the basis for our education system today. Noah Webster, who was considered the schoolmaster of the Republic, also focused on increasing education in America. Namely, not only do we want to increase education, but we also want to infuse patriotism in education as well. If children are learning to read, why shouldn't they learn to read something that's patriotic? Also, as a way to increase education, Noah Webster also created the first standardized American English dictionary, Webster's Dictionary, in 1828. This was not only in order to increase education, but to also increase patriotism, because now we are not necessarily speaking the King's English, so to speak. We're getting rid of all those U's in the words like color and things like that. That is a British thing, and now we speak American English based on Noah Webster's Dictionary. And finally, William McGuffey in the 1830s published what were known as McGuffey Readers. These are standardized reading lessons that were sold. Millions upon millions upon millions of copies of the McGuffey Reader were sold to schools all over the United States at this time. So once again, it is standardizing reading lessons for young children, but once again, the reading lessons that they are reading in the McGuffey Reader focus on patriotism, focus on morality. So it is infusing these ideas into children as well. Now, education is obviously not just a younger child, elementary school level, but there's also a focus on higher learning as well, creating more colleges, state-run colleges, using those federal land grants that we've already talked about out west, particularly in that Northwest Territory, creating colleges that are not one denomination or another, like the University of Virginia was a state-sponsored college. Increasing education for women as well during the 1800s. Now, by and large, giving women more education was semi-looked down upon. Remember, they needed to be in the home, they needed to be the perfect wife and mother as based on that cult of domesticity, and many people truly believed that giving women more education might hurt their delicate brains. But some reformers started pushing for more education for women, because remember, if women are going to be at the heart of the family, if they're going to be at the heart of society, why shouldn't they also have education? So some schools started admitting women, like Troy Female Seminary in New York, and Oberlin College in Ohio started admitting women in 1837. Now, beyond all of that, even if you don't have an education and you have no access to school, there is still something known as the Lyceum Lecture Association. This was an organization that focused on bringing education to the masses through lecture series. So even if you had no access to education, you couldn't go to school, etc., you could go and sit in on a Lyceum lecture, something dealing with science, literature, morality, etc., and they would bring in experts on these situations and speak to the common people. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a favorite Lyceum lecturer at this time. So, other areas of reform other than education. Once again, this is all coming back to that Second Great Awakening. If we want to create that perfect Christian kingdom here on earth, why shouldn't we reform society? So we're already focusing on reforming education. Other areas of reform that these people wanted to focus their attention on dealt with debtors' prisons. Let's reform prisons in general. Let's redo the criminal code so that we no longer are just throwing people away in prison, but now they are focusing on reintegrating them back into society. So no longer are we sending people to prison, but we are sending people to penitentiaries where they can pay penance and learn to become a viable member of society again. Dorothea Dix, who is a favorite multiple choice question on the AP exam, she was one of those middle class women that focused on reforming insane asylums for those people that were mentally handicapped. Now, at this time in society, pretty much any sort of problem that you had could be deemed a mental illness. Like bipolarism, you would be sent away to an insane asylum, and the conditions were extremely terrible. She actually went undercover into one of these insane asylums to show how terrible it was in the state of Massachusetts. People were chained to the walls, they were filthy, they were treated like animals. So in 1843, after her expose, she presented her eyewitness account to the Massachusetts state legislature to help bring about reform of these insane asylums, or what we would say mental hospitals today. And also, if we are going to create a perfect Christian kingdom here on earth, why shouldn't we try to get rid of war as well? So the American Peace Society was formed in 1828 by William Ladd. Now, obviously, they had some major setbacks, namely the Civil War being a huge one of those setbacks, but this did become an international organization in the early 1900s and would eventually, in part, lead us to the League of Nations and later on the United Nations to help bring about an end to war. if we are going to create a perfect Christian kingdom, why shouldn't we also get rid of alcohol? To many of these middle-class Christian women, alcoholism was the root of evil in American society. It was difficult to have a good family life when alcoholism was present. It was difficult for people to work in the factories when alcoholism was present. So to these people, it was not only a physical threat, but a threat to family and faith as well. So, people who subscribe to the idea of temperance means get rid of alcohol, namely the American Temperance Foundation formed in 1826 in Boston, asking people to sign a temperance pledge where they promise to get rid of alcohol. Temperance is a more moderate version of this. They say that we should avoid alcohol versus teetotalism. These are the more zealot of the people among us that are focusing on eliminating alcohol altogether. Now, long before Prohibition, which comes about in the 1920s, that made alcohol illegal in the United States, long before that happened, we did see temperance on a local level and on a state level. Starting in Maine in 1851, Neil S. Dow helped to sponsor a bill to prohibit the making and selling of alcohol in the state of Maine. So other states followed this lead. And long before national prohibition, we did see prohibition, meaning no alcohol, on local levels and on state levels. But this is still a long road to hoe, and prohibition is still many, many, many years off on a national level.